The rain fell in cold, punishing sheets, turning the city streets into a slick mirror of bleeding neon. Each gasp for air was a battle, a fire in Emma's lungs that competed with the sharper, more urgent pain in her side. She ran, not with purpose, but with the blind panic of a hunted animal. The thin fabric of her dress, already torn at the shoulder, was soaked through and clung to her like a second skin, offering no protection from the biting wind. Her bare feet slapped against the gritty pavement, each step a fresh jolt of agony. She had lost her shoes somewhere back there, in the pristine, silent house that had become her prison. Her mind was a storm of its own, a chaotic loop of a slammed door, a shattered crystal vase, and her father's voice, low and venomous. Richard Hayes, a man who presented a face of polished charm to the world, had shown his true self again. This time the rage had been different, colder, more final. She had seen it in his eyes, a possessive fury that promised there would be no next time. No more quiet defiance, no more escape. So she had run. She had finally, truly run. A sharp cramp seized her, radiating from the gash just above her hip. She pressed a trembling hand against the wound, feeling the warm, sticky wetness that seeped through her fingers. Blood. So much of it. The sight made her stomach churn. Her vision swam, the city lights blurring into long, weeping streaks of color. She stumbled, catching herself against the cold brick of a building, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Just keep going. The thought was a weak pulse in the overwhelming roar of pain and fear. Don't let him find you. She pushed off the wall and forced her legs to move, weaving through the late-night crowds. People were just obstacles, faceless shapes under umbrellas who barely glanced at the desperate girl in the ruined dress. To them, she was invisible, just another piece of the city's unfortunate scenery. A siren wailed in the distance, and for a terrifying second, she thought it was for her. She imagined him calling them, reporting a missing daughter, a mentally unstable girl who needed to be brought home for her own good. He was a master of twisting the narrative. He could make the whole world believe she was the one who was broken. Her fingers tightened around the small, heart-shaped locket at her throat. It was silver, tarnished with age, its delicate chain cold against her feverish skin. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of her mother, a woman she barely remembered, whose smile was the only proof of a time before the fear. It was her only anchor. Clutching it now, she felt a flicker of her mother's imagined strength. It was not enough. Her legs grew heavier, each step like wading through deep water. The energy that had propelled her from the house was gone, burned away by adrenaline and blood loss. The world was tilting, the sounds of the city fading into a dull, distant hum. She needed to hide. She needed to get off the main street. Her eyes scanned the buildings, searching for a shadow, a refuge. She saw it then, a narrow gap between a closed laundromat and a boarded-up storefront, an alleyway. It was dark and uninviting, reeking of damp garbage and something sour, but it was a place to disappear. With the last of her strength, she lurched into the darkness, her shoulder scraping against the rough brick. The sudden quiet was deafening. The roar of the city traffic was muffled here, replaced by the steady drip of water from a rusted pipe overhead. The ground was slick with filth, and she slipped, her hands landing in a puddle of icy, foul-smelling water. A wave of nausea and dizziness washed over her. She tried to push herself up, to crawl deeper into the shadows, but her body refused to obey. Her back found the cold, damp wall, and she slid down it, leaving a dark smear of red on the grimy bricks. The fight was over. The cold was seeping into her bones now, a deep, invasive chill that had nothing to do with the rain. This is it. The thought came with a strange, hollow calm. This is where it ends. Not in the suffocating silence of her father's house, but in a filthy alley alone. She thought of the faint, silvery scar along her jawline, a memento from her 16th birthday. Her father had called it a lesson in respect. She had so many lessons. Her head fell forward, her dark, wavy hair curtaining her face. The rain began to lessen, but she barely noticed. Her world had shrunk to the burning in her side and the sound of her own weakening heartbeat. Through her half-closed eyelids, the flickering red neon sign from a bar across the street pulsed erratically, casting long, menacing shadows that danced like ghosts. One of them seemed to detach from the wall, growing larger, darker. It started with a sound, a low purr that was too smooth, too powerful for this derelict street. Headlights cut through the gloom, pinning her in their harsh, white glare. She flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. He found me. The terror was a final, sickening surge. But there was no shouting, no angry footsteps. Instead, a car door opened and closed with a heavy, insulated thud. The sound of wealth, the sound of power. It did not belong here. She dared to open her eyes a fraction. She saw a pair of immaculate black leather shoes, polished to a mirror shine, stepping into the edge of a murky puddle without hesitation. They stopped a few feet from her. Her gaze traveled up, past the sharp crease of dark, tailored trousers, past a long coat that seemed to absorb the little light available. Her eyes finally reached his face. It was all harsh lines and shadows, a face carved from stone. He was tall, imposing, and stood with an unnerving stillness, as if he commanded the very air around him. His dark hair was slicked back from the rain, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a startling, piercing blue, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that was neither kind nor cruel. It was something else entirely. It was calculating, assessing. This was not her father. This was a different kind of danger, a deeper, quieter kind. He said nothing. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. In his silence, she felt her entire miserable life being weighed and measured. The torn dress, the blood, the desperation. He saw it all. For a moment, all her fear vanished, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it felt like a release. She was so tired of fighting, of being afraid, of being alone. This man, this stranger who radiated a cold, lethal authority, was the last person she would ever see. And in that moment of absolute surrender, a single childish impulse broke through the fog of pain. A desperate longing for a simple human comfort she had been denied her entire life. Her lips parted, and a sound, barely a whisper, escaped. It was the most honest thing she had ever said. "Hold me." The world dissolved into blackness before she could see his reaction. Her head slumped to the side, and the last of her consciousness slipped away. Jack Costello stood frozen, the girl's whispered plea hanging in the damp air. It was a request so raw, so vulnerable, it struck a chord deep within him that he thought had died years ago. He ran a criminal enterprise built on control, fear, and the absolute rejection of sentiment. Weakness was a liability, and this girl was the embodiment of it. She was bleeding out in his alley, behind one of his properties. She was a problem, a loose end. His driver, Thomas Bell, leaned across the passenger seat, his voice a low, urgent rasp. "Boss, what is it?" He saw the crumpled figure in the shadows. "Forget it. Let's go. It's not our business." Tommy was right. It wasn't their business. His rules were simple. Never get emotionally involved. Never bring strays into the fold. It was how he had survived. It was how he had built his empire after the tragedy that had made him its leader. He looked down at the girl, at the pale skin, the dark hair plastered to her face. He saw the old, faded scar on her jaw, a pale silver line that told a story of past violence. And he saw the fresh, dark blood soaking the front of her dress, a testament to present danger. "Hold me." The words echoed again, not in the alley but inside his own head. It was a plea for warmth, for safety. Not for money, not for a doctor, just for contact. He had spent a decade building walls around himself, and this dying girl with a single breathless request had found a crack in them. Every instinct, every rule he lived by, screamed at him to turn around, get back in the car, and forget he ever saw her. He did not. Ignoring Tommy's protest, Jack took a step forward. He knelt, the knee of his expensive suit pressing into the wet, gritty ground. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek. Her skin was clammy, dangerously cold. Her silver locket was caught against the torn fabric of her dress, its dented surface glinting in the faint light. It was a fragile, broken thing, just like her. He made his decision. It was impulsive, it was reckless, it was a violation of every principle that kept him alive. Without another moment of hesitation, he slid one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back, lifting her from the ground. She was shockingly light, a fragile weight in his arms. Her head lolled back, resting against his chest, and a soft, pained sigh escaped her lips. The movement dislodged her hand from her side, and a fresh wave of blood seeped through her dress, instantly soaking into the sleeve of his white shirt and the dark wool of his suit jacket. The warm, wet stain spread across the pristine fabric. Jack didn't even flinch. He carried her out of the alley's darkness and into the glare of the headlights. He walked to the rear door of the car and opened it, carefully laying her across the plush leather of the back seat. Her blood was a stark, crimson smear on the immaculate interior. He shut the door and got into the passenger seat beside Tommy. His right-hand man stared at him, his face a mixture of disbelief and deep concern. "Jack, what are you doing? Who is she?" Jack ignored the question. He stared straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield, his jaw tight. The cold, controlled mask of Jack the Ghost Costello was firmly back in place, but he could feel the warmth of her blood on his arm, a tangible mark of the line he had just crossed. He turned his head just enough to meet Tommy's worried gaze, his blue eyes like chips of ice. Drive. The first thing she felt was silk. It was a cool, liquid sensation against her skin, a shocking contrast to the memory of grit and wet pavement. A low, persistent hum vibrated through the mattress, the sound of a city far below. Her eyelids fluttered open, heavy and slow. She was not in an alley, she was in a bed larger than any she had ever seen, draped in sheets the color of deep charcoal. The room was vast and unnervingly quiet. One entire wall was a window, a single pane of glass revealing a breathtaking panorama of the city skyline. Skyscrapers pierced a gray morning sky, their tops lost in cloud. It was a view from the heavens, a god's perspective. It made her feel impossibly small, a forgotten doll in a giant sterile house. The air smelled clean, a mix of something like lemon and expensive leather, with a faint, sharp undertone of antiseptic that made her stomach clench. A dull, throbbing ache pulsed in her side. With trembling fingers, Emma lifted the hem of the soft black t-shirt she was wearing. It wasn't hers. Beneath it, taped securely to her skin, was a pristine white gauze pad. The dressing was professional, clean, the kind a doctor would apply, not the clumsy work of a stranger in a back alley. A cold dread, far deeper than the rain had been, seeped into her bones. This wasn't a rescue. This was a transaction. She had been collected. Her mind raced, trying to stitch together the fractured images. The pouring rain, the slick feel of her own blood on her hands, the blinding headlights of a car. And then a man's face, carved from stone, with eyes the color of a winter sky. He had knelt, his perfect suit jacket absorbing the filth of the alley as he looked down at her. Had she spoken? Had she begged him for something? The memory was a ghost, whispering just beyond her reach. She remembered the feeling of being lifted, the strange sense of surrender as her head fell back. And then, only darkness. Panic began to bubble in her chest. She was trapped. She had run from one cage only to find herself in another, this one gilded and hanging in the sky. Her hand instinctively went to her neck, her fingers closing around the cool, familiar shape of the silver locket hidden beneath the shirt. It was still there. The small, dented heart felt like the only real thing in this entire terrifying place. It was her only link to a time before her father's shadow had consumed everything. She squeezed it tight, the worn metal digging into her palm, a tiny point of pain to anchor her. The bedroom door opened with a sound so faint it was barely a whisper. Emma's heart leaped into her throat. He stood in the doorway, the man from the alley. He was even more imposing in the light of day. Today he wore a dark gray suit, tailored so perfectly it seemed a part of him. His dark hair was short, his posture rigid with a control that was more intimidating than any overt threat. He didn't speak, he just watched her, his piercing blue eyes scanning the room before they settled on her, pinning her to the bed. He closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing in the silent room like a cell door locking. Emma shrank back against the mountain of pillows, pulling the silk sheet up to her chin. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, pulling a sleek, minimalist chair from a nearby desk and placing it a few feet from the bed. He sat down, the fabric of his trousers making no sound. He simply watched her, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight, pressing down on her, crushing the air from her lungs. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, her fear a fascinating subject for his detached study. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, devoid of any emotion. "The doctor said you'll live." It was not a comfort. It was a statement of fact, a confirmation that his investment, whatever it was not a total loss. Emma could only numb, her throat too tight to form words. "He said you lost a lot of blood," Jack continued, his gaze unwavering. "He also said the wound was from a knife, a small one, but used with force." He paused, letting the clinical description hang in the air. "I want to know who did this to you." Her father's face flashed in her mind, his handsome features twisted with rage, his voice a venomous hiss. The memory of the small, ornate letter opener he kept on his desk, its silver handle cold in his hand. She flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement that did not escape the man's notice. She could not say his name. Richard Hayes was a powerful man, a man with a carefully crafted public image of a benevolent businessman and grieving widower. He had friends everywhere. To speak his name would be to sign her own death warrant. He would find her. He always found her. "What is your name?" Jack asked, his tone still perfectly level. She had to give him something. "Emma," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She left her surname buried, a secret she would guard with her life. "Emma," he repeated, tasting the name. It sounded foreign and insignificant in his mouth. "Who did this to you, Emma?" The lie came stumbling out, thin and brittle. My boyfriend," she stammered, hating how weak she sounded. She stared at a spot on the charcoal gray sheets, unable to meet those impossibly blue eyes. "We had a fight. It got out of hand. I had to leave." The silence that followed was worse than his questions. She could feel his scrutiny, a physical pressure on her skin. He knew. He had to know she was lying. Men like him, men who moved with such chilling confidence and lived in places like this, they would be experts in deception. She risked a glance at him. His expression had not changed. He was a statue of cold composure, but a faint scar cutting through his eyebrow seemed to tighten. "This boyfriend," Jack said, his voice dropping a fraction lower. "Does he have a name?" Panic seized her. She couldn't invent a whole person, a whole history under this kind of pressure. Her mind was a blank wall of static. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not going back, I promise. I won't cause you any trouble. I just needed to get away from him." Her plea sounded pathetic even to her own ears. Jack was silent for a long moment, his gaze so intense she felt it could see every terrified thought in her head. Then he stood up, the motion fluid and decisive. He walked to the massive window, turning his back to her to look out at the city below. The gesture was one of dismissal, as if her clumsy lie was not even worthy of being challenged. It was more terrifying than any accusation. "You collapsed in my alley," he said to the glass. "Your blood is on the leather of my car. Now you are in my home. You have already caused me trouble." Emma's breath hitched. She watched his reflection in the dark glass, a powerful silhouette against the sprawling city. He was right. She had bled all over his perfect, ordered world. She was a stain, a complication. "I can leave," she offered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "As soon as I can walk properly, I'll go. You'll never see me again." He turned his head slightly, his reflection's eyes meeting hers in the window. A cold flicker of something unreadable passed through them. "You will go nowhere," he said, his voice flat and final. "You will stay here until I have decided what to do with you." The words were not a promise of safety. They were a declaration of ownership. The room, which had seemed like a luxurious prison, now felt like a holding cell. She was his problem. And he was the kind of man who solved his problems permanently. A low, discreet buzz vibrated from his suit pocket. He pulled out a sleek black phone, his movements economical. He glanced at the screen, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He answered it, turning his back to her once more, his broad shoulders blocking the view of the city. "Tommy," he said. His voice was different now, sharper. The voice of a man used to command. Emma strained to hear, her entire body rigid with tension. She could only hear Jack's side of the conversation, a series of clipped commands and questions that painted a terrifying picture. "What have you got?" he asked. There was a pause. Emma imagined a voice on the other end, relaying information. "He's using his own security, not just the police. Interesting." Another pause. Longer this time. Jack stood a little straighter. "Say that name again." A heavy silence filled the room. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure dread. She knew what was coming. Richard Hayes, Jack, the name spoken with a new, chilling resonance. The sound of her father's name in this room, from this man's lips, was like a physical blow. Emma gasped, a choked, strangled sound. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. It was happening. Her father had cast his net, and she was caught in it. And now so was the dangerous man who had her trapped in his tower in the sky. Jack was still listening. "What kind of influence?" had he asked. Another pause. "And his connections?" Emma watched his shoulders tense, a subtle shift in his posture that screamed danger. The muscles in his back hardened under the expensive fabric of his suit. "I see," he said, and his voice was now laced with something that had not been there before. Not anger, but a cold, predatory interest. "That complicates things." He listened for another moment. "Keep digging, Tommy. I want to know everything he has breakfast with. Every call he makes, every shadow he got of us. Everything." He ended the call. He did not turn around immediately. He stood motionless, a dark statue contemplating the city, but Emma knew he wasn't seeing the view. He was processing the new information. He was reevaluating her. She was no longer just a girl running from an abusive boyfriend. She was the daughter of Richard Hayes, a man with influence, a man with connections to his rivals. She wasn't just trouble anymore. She was a liability, a pawn in a war she didn't understand. The silence in the room became absolute, a suffocating void where the only sound was the frantic pounding of her own heart. She felt lightheaded, the edges of her visions starting to blur. She had nowhere left to run. The monster from her past was hunting her, and the monster in her present now knew exactly who she was. Slowly, deliberately, Jack Costello turned around. The detached curiosity in his face was gone. His features were set like granite, his mouth a thin, hard line. The coldness in his eyes had sharpened into something that cut right through her. It was the look of a man who had been lied to, a man who saw not a frightened girl, but a piece of a puzzle he was now forced to solve. He took a step toward the bed, then another. He stopped just out of reach, looking down at her, his shadow falling across the silk sheets. He held her gaze, and in the depths of his narrowed blue eyes, she saw nothing but ice-cold suspicion. He spoke, his voice quiet, yet it boomed in the silent room, a death knell for her pathetic lie. "Your father is looking for you." The words hung in the sterile air of the penthouse, sharp and cold as shards of glass. "Your father is looking for you." Emma felt the breath leave her body in a silent rush, as if Jack had reached across the room and punched the air from her lungs. The lie she had so carefully constructed, the flimsy story of a jealous boyfriend, disintegrated. It was a shield made of paper against a battering ram. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum against her ribs, seemed to stop altogether. For a single terrifying second, the world went quiet. Richard Hayes. The name was a curse. It was the sound of a heavy hand, the sting of a cruel word disguised as concern, the chilling echo of a door locking late at night. She stared at Jack, whose face remained a mask of detached appraisal. His blue eyes were not just looking at her. They were dissecting her, searching for the truth she had tried so desperately to hide. The expensive fabric of the sheets felt like a trap, the vast empty room, a cage. She was cornered. A choked sound escaped her lips. "No," she whispered, the word thin and brittle. It was an instinct, a final futile attempt to push the nightmare away. "That's not... I don't know who that is." Jack did not move. He did not blink. He simply stood there, an immovable object of power and dark suits, letting her lie hang in the space between them until it suffocated. "Richard Hayes," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft, "is a very influential man. He has reported his daughter Emma missing. He has told the police she is emotionally unstable, prone to fits of fantasy. He has painted a picture of a concerned father, worried sick about his fragile child. Each word was a nail hammered into her coffin. Fragile child. Unstable. He was already poisoning the world against her, just as he had always done. He was twisting her desperate flight for life into a pathetic, childish tantrum. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, hot and acidic. She could feel the carefully constructed walls inside her begin to crack. "He's a liar," she finally gasped, the words tearing from her throat. The dam broke. Sobs shook her small frame, among and convulsive. It was not a quiet, dignified weeping. It was the ugly, wrenching sound of years of terror and pain finally breaking free. "He's a monster." She curled into herself on the massive bed, pulling her knees to her chest as if she could make herself disappear. The story came out in a torrent, a chaotic flood of broken sentences and ragged breaths. She told him everything. Not just the cut on her side, but the scar on her jaw from a signet ring thrown in anger 2 years ago. Not just his shouting, but the silent, terrifying control. The way he would lock her in her room for days. The way he monitored her calls, her friends, her life, until she had no one left. She spoke of his public charm, the celebrated philanthropist who smiled for cameras and donated to charities. And she described the private tyrant who ruled their silent, opulent house with an iron fist. He did not just hit her, he dismantled her, piece by piece, telling her she was worthless, that no one would ever believe her, that she owed him everything. She was his possession, a beautiful, broken thing to be kept on a shelf. "The night I ran," she choked out, her voice raw, "he found out I had applied for a small job at a library a few towns over. I wanted to save enough money to just go. He said I was ungrateful, that I was his and I would never leave." She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, trying to block out the memory of his face, contorted with rage. "He had a letter opener on his desk. He said he would mark me so that if anyone else ever looked at me, they would know I belonged to him." The penthouse was utterly silent, save for her ragged breathing. She had laid her soul bare, exposing every ugly, shameful secret. She waited for the disgust, the dismissal. She waited for him to tell her she was too much trouble, a problem he did not need. She had brought a war to his doorstep, and he had every reason to throw her back to the wolves. She slowly lowered her hands, preparing for the final blow. But Jack's expression had changed. The cold, analytical suspicion was gone. In its place was something else, something deeper and far more difficult to read. It was a stillness, a focused intensity that seemed to absorb all the chaos she had just unleashed. He looked at the pale, silvery scar on her jawline, then back to her tear-filled eyes. He saw the truth there, stark and undeniable. This was not a lie. This was not a game. This was the genuine terror of a hunted animal. For years, Jack Costello had lived by a strict set of rules. He did not get involved. He did not allow emotion to dictate his actions. Every decision was a calculation of risk versus reward. Emma Hayes was a catastrophic risk. Her father was not just a wealthy businessman. He had connections to Jack's rivals, a fact Tommy had made chillingly clear. Harboring her was an invitation to a war on two fronts. Logic dictated he cut her loose immediately, but logic was not what was speaking to him now. What he felt was a cold, rising tide of fury. It was a deep, resonant anger directed not at her, but at the man who had done this. He saw the ghost of another time, another kind of violence that had shaped his own life, that had forged him into the man he was. In Emma's terror, he recognized a piece of his own buried past, and a protective instinct, one he thought he had strangled long ago, roared to life. He walked to the edge of the bed and sat down, not close enough to touch her, but near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. The mattress dipped under his weight. Emma flinched, her body tensing for a blow that did not come. He looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes holding hers. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, a gravelly sound that was not a comfort, but a verdict. "He won't touch you again," he said. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact, a law he had just written into existence. Emma stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. The tears had stopped. She was just a mess of trembling limbs and wide, disbelieving eyes. "You stay with me," he commanded softly. "You are under my protection now. Do you understand?" She could only nod, a small, jerky movement. The words were impossible. Protection. Stay with me. They were concepts she had given up on, fantasies from a life she could never have. To hear them now from this dangerous, powerful man felt like a dream. A terrifying, beautiful dream from which she was sure she would wake. He was not saving her out of kindness. She knew that. Men like him did not operate on kindness. He was claiming her, in a way. But his claim felt like a shield, not a cage. For the first time in her life, the feeling of being owned did not feel like a threat. It felt like a promise of survival. Jack stood up, his brief moment of stillness over. The calculating mind was working again, the pieces on the chessboard already moving. "Get some rest," he ordered, his tone returning to its usual clipped authority. "Someone will bring you food. Do not leave this room." He turned and walked out, closing the door behind him with a soft, definitive click. Emma was left alone in the silence. She slowly unfolded herself, her limbs aching. She touched her jaw, the old scar a faint, raised line beneath her fingertips. "He won't touch you again." The words echoed in the vast, empty space of the penthouse, and in the even larger space of her heart. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to take root in the barren soil of her fear. 2 hours later, a quiet, middle-aged woman brought a tray of food. She did not speak, simply set it down, gave a small nod, and left. Emma ate mechanically, the rich flavors lost on her. Her mind was a whirlwind of Jack's words and the terrifying memory of her father. She felt suspended in an unreal reality, a guest in a gilded cage who had just been promised sanctuary by its keeper. Later, there was a knock on the door. It was not Jack, but two large men dressed in the same impeccable dark suits as the driver from that first night. They were built like brick boys, their faces impassive and professional. One of them spoke, his voice polite but firm. "Miss Hayes, we're moving you. Please come with us." Panic flared in her chest. "Moving me? Where? Did Mr. Costello say?" "He has arranged for a more secure location," the man said, cutting her off gently. "It's for your safety. Please." He gestured toward the hallway. There was no room for argument. These men were extensions of Jack's will. She had placed her trust in him, and this was the first test. Swallowing her fear, she nodded and followed them out of the room. They moved silently through the penthouse, their footsteps muffled by the plush carpets. They descended in a private elevator, the ride so smooth it was almost imperceptible. The underground garage was a cavern of polished concrete and luxury cars. A black sedan, identical to the one that had first brought her here, was waiting with its engine humming quietly. One man opened the rear door for her and she slid onto the cool leather seats. He got in beside her while the other took the passenger seat up front. The driver, a third man, simply nodded at the rear view mirror. The heavy garage door rolled up and they drove out into the blinding light of a city afternoon. The sudden transition from the dim, controlled environment of the penthouse to the chaos of midday traffic was jarring. People hurried along sidewalks, yellow cabs jockeyed for position, and the sun glinted off 1,000 windows. For a few minutes it felt almost normal. She was just a woman in the back of a car, watching the world go by. The brief illusion of normalcy was a balm to her frayed nerves. They were on a wide avenue, heading toward a bridge that arched over the river. The traffic was dense, moving at a steady crawl. Emma watched the sunlight dance on the water, her mind drifting. Maybe this would be okay. Maybe he had a plan. Maybe she could finally be safe. The screech of tires shattered her thoughts. A dark blue sedan, appearing from nowhere, swerved violently in front of them, cutting them off. Her driver slammed on the brakes, and Emma was thrown forward, caught only by the man beside her, whose arms shot out like a steel bar to brace her. The world devolved into a symphony of blaring horns and the sickening crunch of metal as the car behind them failed to stop in time. Before the chaos could even register, the doors of the blue sedan were thrown open. 4 men, their faces obscured by dark ski masks, spilled out. They moved with a terrifying predatory speed. This was not a random act of road rage. This was an attack, a coordinated professional ambush. Emma's blood ran cold. Her breath hitched in her throat. A strangled, silent scream. It was him. It had to be him. Her father had found her. The man beside her in the car was already speaking into a device on his wrist, his voice calm and lethal. Ambush, Sector 7, hostile contact. Two of the masked men were on her side of the car. One of them slammed the butt of a handgun against the reinforced window. The glass spiderwebbed but did not break. He hit it again, harder. The sound was like a gunshot next to her ear. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, a pathetic whimper escaping her lips. This was it. They were going to drag her out of the car back into the nightmare. The door was wrenched open. The man who had hit the window was a dark shape filling the frame, his hand reaching for her. "Get out of the car! Now!" he snarled. But the movement was not completed. There was a soft, muffled cough from the front seat. The man who had been reaching for her suddenly stiffened. A small, dark hole appeared on his chest. His eyes went wide with surprise behind the mask. He staggered back a single step and then crumpled to the pavement, silent and still. The second masked man raised his own weapon, but he was too slow. The door on the other side of the car flew open. The guard who had been sitting next to Emma was now outside, moving with a fluid, brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. He met the second attacker head-on, not with a gun, but with his bare hands. There was a swift, sharp exchange of movements, a sickening crack of bone, and the second man fell. It all happened in less than 5 seconds. It was a blur of calculated violence, so fast and so final it barely seemed real. The two remaining attackers, seeing their partners neutralized, scrambled back toward their car. The driver of Emma's car was already out, his own weapon drawn, firing 2 precise shots that blew out the tires of the getaway vehicle. The sedan lurched to a halt. Emma sat frozen in the back seat, her mind unable to process the whirlwind of violence she had just witnessed. The smell of burnt rubber and something else, something metallic and coppery, filled the air. Her protector, the man who had been sitting beside her, slid back into the car. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the scene outside, his face a mask of cold focus. "The threat is neutralized," he said into his wrist device. "Package it is secure. We are proceeding to the alternate location." Package. That's what she was. A package to be protected, to be secured. The thought did not offend her. It grounded her. In this brutal new world, being a package was better than being a victim. The driver got back in, and with a squeal of tires, he maneuvered the car around the disabled vehicle and the still forms lying on the asphalt. People were screaming on the sidewalks, pointing, their faces masks of shock and horror. No one moved to intervene. Within moments, they were back in the flow of traffic, leaving the scene of contained carnage behind them as if it were a bad dream. Emma was shaking uncontrollably now, the adrenaline giving way to a deep, bone-chilling shock. She wrapped her arms around herself, but she could not get warm. The brutal reality of what had just happened crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. Her father's reach was long, his methods ruthless. He had not sent the police. He had sent men to take her by force, in the middle of the day, in the middle of the city. Jack's promise echoed in her ears. He won't touch you again. But he had. He had reached for her. He had tried to drag her back into the darkness. Miles away in his sterile penthouse office overlooking the city, Jack Costello took the call. He listened without speaking, his back to the floor-to-ceiling window. Tommy Bell stood across the room watching his boss's posture. He saw Jack's hand, the one holding the phone, tighten into a white-knuckled fist. He saw the muscles in his jaw bunch, a single corded vein throbbing at his temple. "Understood," Jack said, his voice a low, deadly calm. He ended the call. For a long moment, he did not move. He just stared out at the sprawling metropolis below, a city he considered his own. Someone had dared to challenge him, to attempt to steal something from him in his own territory. It was not just an attack on Emma. It was a flagrant act of disrespect, a declaration of war aimed directly at him. The protective instinct he had felt earlier now curdled into something far colder, far more dangerous. It was a rage so profound it became perfectly still. When he finally turned around, his blue eyes were no longer the color of the sky. They were the color of glacial ice. The attempted abduction was a failure, but its message had been delivered with brutal clarity. The danger was not a distant threat. It was here now. It was immediate, and it was escalating with terrifying speed. And both a shaken Emma, now hidden away in a new unknown location, and a furious Jack understood that the first move in a very bloody game had just been played. The aftermath of the attack hung in the air, a metallic taste of violence and fear. The pristine black car, now scarred with shattered glass and dented metal, was a testament to how close Richard Hayes had come. Jack had said nothing, his jaw a line of granite as he surveyed the damage. His silence was more terrifying than any shout. He made one call, his voice low and cold, issuing orders that Emma could not fully understand but whose meaning was clear. There would be consequences. Now, hours later, they were in a different car, a sleek, unassuming sedan. Jack was driving this time, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The city's chaotic symphony of sirens and horns faded behind them, replaced by the monotonous hum of tires on an open highway. Emma sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the world turning from concrete gray to shades of deep green. She felt like a ghost, an observer in a life that was no longer her own. Each mile they drove put more distance between her and her father, yet the fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach. She chanced to look at the man beside her. In the sterile light of his penthouse, he was an imposing figure of power and control. Here, with the afternoon sun slanting through the windshield, he looked different, almost human. A faint scar cut through his eyebrow, a detail she hadn't noticed before. He had not explained where they were going. He had simply appeared at her door and said, "We're leaving." There was no room for questions. The silence in the car was a living thing. It was heavy with the unspoken terror of the afternoon, with the shock of brutal violence played out in broad daylight. Emma's hands were clenched in her lap. She kept replaying the image of Jack's men moving with such chilling efficiency. They were protectors, but they were also killers. And the man driving her into the unknown was their master. The thought should have made her recoil, but instead a strange, unsettling sense of security settled over her. For the first time in her life, her father's rage had been met with a greater, more decisive force. Jack felt her gaze on him. He kept his eyes on the road. Having her this close in the enclosed space of the car was a disruption to his carefully ordered world. He could smell the faint, clean scent of the soap from his own bathroom on her skin. It was an intimacy he had not permitted himself in years. He had rules. Rules that kept him alive, that kept his organization intact. Emma Hayes broke every single one of them. The logical part of his brain, the part that had guided him since he was a boy, screamed that she was a liability, a weakness his enemies would exploit. But the memory of her crumpled in that alley, the memory of her terror when she spoke of her father, silenced that voice. Protecting her had become an instinct, an imperative that defied all logic. After nearly 2 hours, he turned off the main road onto a narrow, unpaved lane shrouded by a canopy of pine trees. The car bumped along the gravel path, the forest closing in around them. Sunlight dappled through the branches, painting shifting patterns on the dashboard. Emma felt her breath catch. It was beautiful and utterly isolated. The lane opened into a small clearing that sloped down to the edge of a vast, tranquil lake. A rustic cabin built of dark logs and river stones stood nestled among the trees, a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney. Jack pulled the car to a stop and killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant cry of a loon. "Where are we?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "A safe place," Jack said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "No one knows about it, not even Tommy." The admission hung in the air between them. He had brought her to a place of absolute secrecy, a sanctuary even from his most trusted man. The weight of that trust was a physical pressure in Emma's chest. He got out of the car and she followed, her worn sneakers crunching on the gravel. The air was cool and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. It was clean, pure. It felt like the first real breath she had taken in years. Jack unlocked the heavy wooden door, and it swung inward with a soft creak. The inside of the cabin was warm and surprisingly inviting. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire already crackling in its hearth. Worn leather armchairs were pulled up near it, with thick woolen blankets draped over their backs. The furniture was simple, sturdy, and masculine. It was nothing like the cold, minimalist luxury of the penthouse. This place felt lived in. It felt like a home. Someone was here, Emma observed, gesturing to the fire. I called ahead, Jack explained, setting a duffel bag he'd pulled from the trunk on the floor. Had one of my people come out to air the place out and start a fire. They left an hour before we arrived. He surveyed the room, his expression unreadable. This was my father's. He said it simply, a statement of fact. But Emma heard the history in those 3 words. She saw a shadow pass over his eyes, a flicker of some old pain. She wanted to ask more, but she didn't dare. She was a guest here, a refugee. She had no right to his past. He showed her to a small bedroom with a simple wooden bed frame and a thick quilt. The window looked out directly onto the lake, its surface like dark glass. You'll be safe here, he said again, his voice firm, as if trying to convince himself as much as her. My father is a powerful man, she said quietly, looking at her own pale reflection in the window pane. Jack turned from the doorway to face her. His blue eyes were intense. He is a wealthy man with influence. I am a powerful man. There is a difference. The statement was delivered without arrogance. It was a fact. It was the foundation of his world. And now hers. He left her alone, closing the door softly behind him. Emma sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress soft beneath her. She listened to the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floorboards in the main room, the creak as he sat in one of the leather chairs. She was alone with him, miles from anyone, in a cabin no one knew existed. The reality of her situation was overwhelming. Yet the fear that had been her constant companion for so long is muted. Here, surrounded by the scent of wood smoke and pine, it felt distant. Later, as evening began to settle, a new feeling emerged. Hunger. It was a simple, basic need that felt foreign after days of living on adrenaline and fear. She left the bedroom and found Jack staring into the fire, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked lost in thought, the controlled mask he usually wore having slipped just slightly. The firelight danced across the sharp planes of his face, making him look younger and more vulnerable. I'm hungry, she said, her voice startling them both. He looked up, his eyes focusing on her as if pulling himself back from a great distance. There's food in the kitchen. Canned goods mostly. I can open something. No, Emma said, surprising herself. Let me. She walked into the small, functional kitchen. It was stocked with basics: pasta, tinned tomatoes, onions, garlic, some dried herbs. It was not much, but to her it was a feast. She found an apron hanging on a hook and tied it around her waist. The simple act felt grounding. She began to cook, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of chopping an onion, the sizzle as it hit the hot oil in a pan. For a few minutes, she was not a terrified runaway. She was just a young woman making dinner. Jack did not move from his chair, but he watched her. He watched the way her dark hair fell over her shoulder. He watched the careful, precise movements of her hands as she stirred the sauce. No one had cooked for him like this since his mother. Business dinners, catered events, takeout containers eaten alone in his penthouse. That was his life. This simple act of domesticity, of care, felt like a scene from another man's existence. It stirred something in him, a longing for a warmth he had long ago decided he did not deserve. The aroma of garlic and tomatoes filled the cabin, chasing away the cold ghosts of his past. She brought 2 bowls of pasta to the small wooden table near the fireplace. They ate in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the clinking of their forks and the crackle of the fire. The food was simple, but it was the best thing Emma had tasted in a long time. It tasted of freedom. This is good, Jack said, his voice rough. He had finished his entire bowl. Emma felt a blush creep up her neck. It's just pasta. I haven't had a meal like this in a very long time, he admitted, looking not at her but at his empty bowl. The confession was a small crack in his armor. It made him seem less like a mythical crime boss and more like a lonely man. Why did you help me? She asked, the question that had been burning inside her since she woke up in his penthouse. He was silent for a long moment, swirling the last of the whiskey in his glass. "My mother," he said finally, his gaze distant. "She was a kind woman. She always told me that you measure a man not by how he treats his equals, but by how he treats those with nothing to offer him." He looked at Emma then, his eyes holding hers. "You reminded me of her, not in looks, but your eyes. When I found you in that alley, there was a fight in them even then." Emma's heart ached. She thought of her own mother, of the faded photograph she kept hidden away. She thought of the locket. Her hand went instinctively to her throat, her fingers closing around the cool metal. After they cleared the table, the tension between them had changed. It was no longer the sharp edge of fear and uncertainty. It was something softer, more inquisitive. "Let's walk," Jack suggested, already pulling on a dark jacket. Emma nodded, wrapping one of the woolen blankets from the armchair around her shoulders. They stepped out into the crisp night air. A full moon had risen, casting a shimmering silver path across the surface of the lake. The world was painted in shades of silver and black. They walked along the shoreline, their footsteps a quiet crunch on the pebbles. "I used to come here with my father when I was a boy," Jack said, breaking the silence. "Before," he trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the night air. "Before he became the man he was now." Emma understood. She didn't press him. Instead, she looked out over the water. "It's so peaceful. I don't think I've ever known a place this quiet." "The city is loud," he agreed. "It's easy to forget that silence like this exists." As they walked, the moonlight caught the silver at her throat. "What is that?" Jack asked, his steps slowing. Emma's hand went to her locket again. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's the only thing I have of hers." He stopped and turned to her. He was closer than she expected. She could see the deep blue of his eyes, even in the dim light. "May I?" he asked, his hand hovering near her neck. She nodded, her heart starting to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Very gently he reached out. His fingers, warm and calloused, brushed against her skin as he took the locket. The touch was electric, a sudden jolt of warmth in the cold night. It shot through her, a dizzying spark that made her breath catch in her throat. He held the small heart-shaped piece of silver in his palm, examining it under the moonlight. His thumb traced its surface, stopping at the noticeable dent on one side. It was a mark left from a time her father had thrown it against a wall in a fit of rage. "It's dented," he said, his voice low. "I know," she whispered, a wave of shame washing over her. It felt like he was seeing a flaw in her, not just the locket. He looked from the dented silver back to her face, his expression serious. "I can have this fixed for you." It wasn't a question. It was a promise. He was going to repair this small, broken piece of her past. He carefully placed the locket back into her hand, his fingers closing over hers for a fraction of a second to ensure she had it. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it felt momentous. It was a current passing between them, a charge of unspoken feeling. The brief electric touch of their hands lingered in the air between them. Emma stared down at the locket in her palm, her fingers tingling where he had touched them. Jack took a half step back, putting a careful distance between them again, his hands shoved into his pockets. They both stood in the moonlight by the silent lake, not looking at each other. It was a silent acknowledgement of a powerful, growing connection that scared them both. The piece of the cabin was a fragile thing. It lived in the quiet moments after dawn, in the scent of pine and damp earth that drifted through the open window. For 2 days, that piece had been their sanctuary. Emma felt the ghost of Jack's touch on her hand long after he had released her locket. The memory was a spark of warmth against the constant low hum of her fear. It was a promise she replayed in her mind, a silent vow made by the still, dark water of the lake. But on the third morning, the city reached for them. It came through the thin wire of Jack's phone. Emma was pouring coffee, the ceramic mug warm in her hands, when she heard his voice change. He stood with his back to her, staring out at the placid lake, but his posture was rigid. The relaxed line of his shoulders was gone, replaced by a familiar tension that coiled in his neck. His words were clipped, stripped of all warmth. "How many containers?" he asked. There was a long pause. "And the Port Authority? On what grounds?" Emma's hand faltered. She set the coffee pot down with a soft click. She didn't understand the words, the business of them, but she understood the tone. It was the voice of Jack Costello, the man she first met. Cold, dangerous, the man who ran a world she could not comprehend. He had shielded her from it, had built this quiet bubble for them at the edge of the lake. Now she could feel the walls of that bubble thinning, threatening to pop. Jack ended the call without another word. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, a silhouette of command against the morning light. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating. The easy quiet they had shared was replaced by something sharp and anxious. He was here with her, but his mind was miles away, back in the steel and glass towers of his kingdom. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the trouble was because of her. The news from the city was bad, and it got worse with each call. Richard Hayes was not a simple brawler. He was a creature of influence, a man who wielded ledgers and legal threats like weapons. He couldn't get to his daughter with force, so he attacked the foundations of Jack's power. First, it was a major shipment of electronics from Asia, flagged and impounded at the port under a sudden, inexplicable customs audit. The delay alone would cost Jack's organization millions. Then, a lucrative waterfront development deal, one Jack had spent months securing, was abruptly put on hold. The city council cited new environmental concerns, concerns whispered into the right ears by a man with a charming smile and a deep wallet. Richard was squeezing him. He was cutting off the flow of money, creating instability. He was showing Jack's world that harboring Emma Hayes came at a price. The ghost, the man who moved through the city's underworld unseen and untouched, was suddenly visible. He was bleeding money, and his enemies, the ones who had nothing to do with Richard Hayes, were beginning to watch. Weakness in their world was like blood in the water. It drew predators. A sleek black sedan crunched up the gravel driveway late that afternoon. Emma watched from the window as Tommy Bell climbed out. He didn't look at the cabin. His eyes were fixed on Jack, who was already walking out to meet him. Her stomach twisted into a knot. Tommy's presence here meant the trouble was serious. He was Jack's shadow, the anchor that kept his empire steady. If that anchor had to leave the city, the ship was in a storm. She saw them talking near the tree line, their voices too low to carry, but she could read their body language. Jack stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Tommy spoke with an urgent, grounded intensity, his hands gesturing to emphasize his points. This wasn't a report. It was an argument, a confrontation. Emma stepped back from the window, wrapping her arms around herself. She felt like a ghost in her own life, watching two powerful men decide her fate. She was the subject of their tense conversation, the unspoken problem at the center of it all. "It's not just the money, Jack," Tommy said, his voice low but firm. He'd followed Jack to the edge of the woods, far enough from the cabin to be unheard. "The money we can handle, it's the talk." Jack's eyes were like chips of ice. "What talk?" "The capos are getting nervous. They see the hits we're taking. They see the deals going south. They connect the dots. It all started the day you brought her in." Tommy took a breath, holding his boss's gaze. It was the hardest thing he'd ever had to do. "They think you're compromised. They're saying a girl has made you weak." A muscle in Jack's jaw jumped. "I don't give a damn what they think." "You have to," Tommy shot back, his loyalty warring with his pragmatism. "This isn't just you, Jack. It's the whole organization. Your father built it on respect, on the idea that no one could touch us. Richard Hayes is touching us every single day, and he's doing it because you have his daughter. The men see you hold up here away from the city while things are falling apart. They see a king who has abandoned his throne for a prize." "She is not a prize," Jack growled, his voice a low threat. "I know that, but they don't," Tommy insisted, his tone softening slightly. "They just see the risk. They see a liability. They're asking how long you're going to let this go on, how much you're willing to lose for her." The accusation hung in the air between them. Every word was a blow against the decision Jack had made in that rain-slicked alley. He had broken every one of his own rules for Emma. He had chosen emotion over logic, protection over profit. And now his most trusted man was telling him the cost. He wasn't just risking his business, he was risking his authority, his legacy. The fear his name was built on was eroding, being replaced by whispers of weakness. Jack turned his back on Tommy, staring into the dense, dark woods. The peace he'd found here felt like a fantasy a foolish dream. The real world was ruthless and demanding. It didn't allow for quiet moments by a lake. It didn't allow for the warmth he felt when Emma smiled at him. He was Jack Costello. His life was built on control, on calculated moves and the brutal suppression of any threat. He had let his guard down, Bierschren, and Richard Hayes had driven a wedge right into the crack. "Handle the port," Jack said finally, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Pay what you have to pay, and set up a meeting with the councilman. I'll be back in the city tomorrow." "And her?" Tommy asked quietly. Jack didn't answer. He just walked back toward the cabin, his shoulders carrying a weight that hadn't been there that morning. When he came back inside, the change in him was stark. The man who had gently taken her locket, promising to fix it, was gone. In his place was the cold, distant ruler of a criminal empire. He moved through the small cabin like a caged panther, his phone pressed to his ear. His conversations were a series of harsh commands and clipped questions. He didn't look at Emma. He didn't speak to her. It was as if she wasn't even there. She tried to make herself small, to fade into the background. She cleared their lunch plates, the sound of the dishes clinking together seeming loud and intrusive in the tense silence. She wanted to say something, to ask what was wrong, to offer some kind of comfort. But the wall around him was impenetrable. His blue eyes were focused on a world far beyond the cabin, a world where she was nothing but a complication. The fear she had held at bay for 2 beautiful days came rushing back in a suffocating tide. She was a burden. Every tense line on his face, every harsh word into his phone, was her fault. She had brought this storm to his door. She had fled one monster only to endanger the one man who had shown her kindness. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. He had promised to protect her, but who was going to protect him from her? Late in the evening, the calls finally stopped. Jack stood on the porch, staring out into the encroaching darkness. A chill had settled over the lake. Emma hovered in the doorway, her heart aching. She wanted to go to him, to put a hand on his arm, to remind him that she was there. But she was afraid. Afraid of what he might say. Afraid that he already regretted everything. His phone rang again. He snatched it up, his voice a low growl of pure frustration. "What is it now?" he snapped. He listened, his back rigid. Emma could only hear the muffled, frantic sounds from the other end. Then Jack spoke, and the words were so clear, so sharp, they sliced right through the quiet evening air. "The entire shipment is a loss," he said, his voice laced with a fury she had never heard directed at anything but her father. He paced the length of the porch, a caged animal. "This is getting out of control. She's a liability I can't afford right now." Emma froze. The air left her lungs in a painful rush. She, he said she, a liability he couldn't afford. The floor seemed to drop out from under her. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a business deal. It was her. The whispers Tommy had brought from the city were now coming from Jack's own mouth. She was the liability. She was the weakness. She was the price that had become too high. Her mind flashed back to her father's office. The cold, dismissive way he would speak about her when he thought she couldn't hear. A disappointment, an inconvenience, a possession that was causing problems. Jack wasn't like her father. He couldn't be. But the words were the same. The cold calculation was the same. He was a businessman, after all, a man who measured risk and reward, and she was a risk that was costing him his kingdom. The hope that had bloomed inside her chest withered and died in an instant. The warmth of his touch by the lake became a phantom limb, a memory of something she had been foolish enough to believe in. Of course he would give her up. It was the only logical move. He would trade her back to her father to stop the bleeding, to secure his empire, to erase the weakness she represented. He would sacrifice her to save himself. A sob caught in her throat, hot and sharp. She backed away from the door, her movements stiff and robotic. Tears streamed down her face, silent and bitter. She wouldn't wait for him to deliver her. She wouldn't be a bargaining chip. She had run from her father to save her life. Now she would run from Jack to save what was left of her heart. Stumbling into the small bedroom, she found the simple canvas bag they had bought for her. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely work the zipper. She had nothing. A few changes of clothes, the shoes on her feet, the silver locket, her only connection to a life before all this, was gone. He had it. Another piece of her he controlled. She stuffed the clothes into the bag with frantic, desperate movements. Every sound from the porch made her flinch. She expected the door to open at any moment. To see him standing there, his face a mask of cold resolve, ready to tell her it was over. The tears wouldn't stop. They were tears of terror, of betrayal, but mostly of a profound and bottomless heartbreak. She had let herself feel safe. She had let herself believe in a gentle touch and a quiet promise. And it had all been a lie. Zipping the bag, she slung it over her shoulder. The woods outside were dark and unforgiving, but they were better than waiting for the man she had trusted to hand her back to the monster. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. A liability I can't afford. Each syllable was a cold, sharp piece of glass working its way into her heart. All the warmth she had felt in this cabin, all the fragile hope she had allowed to grow, it all turned to ash in her mouth. She was a calculation, a risk on a balance sheet that was tipping into the red. Her presence was costing him, and Jack Costello was a man who always cut his losses. The thought was so clinical, so brutal, that it stole the air from her lungs. Her hands moved with a numb, robotic purpose. She folded the soft sweater he had given her, the one that smelled faintly of him, of wood smoke, and something clean and masculine. She placed it on the bed, a silent return of a borrowed kindness. There was nothing else to pack, just the clothes on her back and the hollow ache in her chest. She was a ghost in his life, and it was time to disappear. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden, but she blinked them back with fierce resolve. She had cried enough. Crying was for people who had the luxury of being saved. She had to save herself. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It had felt so comforting just an hour ago, a beacon of safety. Now its warmth felt like a lie, a cruel mockery of the home she had dared to imagine. Her fingers trembled as she pulled on her shoes. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the inevitable moment he would tell her to leave. She couldn't bear to hear it from his lips. She couldn't watch his cold blue eyes become distant as he handed her over to her father. She slipped toward the back door, her movements as quiet as a mouse. One last glance over her shoulder. The room was empty, waiting for him. A part of her, a foolish, desperate part, wished he would walk in right now, that he would see her and ask what was wrong, that she had misunderstood everything. But she crushed that wish before it could take root. Hope was a dangerous indulgence. She pushed the door open just enough to slip through, the cold night air a shock against her warm skin. The scent of pine and damp earth filled her senses. For a moment, she was frozen on the small porch, a silhouette against the warm light spilling from the window. Then she turned and ran, plunging into the black, unforgiving mouth of the forest. Jack ended the call with Tommy, the frustration a bitter taste in his mouth. He ran a hand over his face, the weight of his world pressing down. Every move he made was scrutinized. Every decision was a risk. He had built his empire on control, on anticipating every threat. But Emma was a variable he had never accounted for, and the chaos she brought was a storm he was struggling to navigate. He was angry at Richard Hayes, at the vipers in his own organization, at the whole damn situation. But he was not angry at her. The thought was so immediate, so certain, it surprised him. He walked back into the main room, a half-formed apology on his lips for the harsh tone she must have overheard. He expected to see her on the sofa, maybe curled up with a book, her dark hair falling over her face. The room was quiet, too quiet. The blanket she had been using was folded on the armchair. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. A strange stillness had settled over the cabin. "Emma?" he called out, his voice sounding loud in the silence. No answer. A prickle of unease crawled up his spine. He strode to the bedroom. It was empty, the bed neatly made. The bathroom door was open, the room dark. He turned, his eyes scanning the space, and that's when he saw it. The back door was cracked open, letting in a thin sliver of the cold night. A sudden visceral fear seized him. It was not the calculated concern of a businessman. It was a raw, personal terror that clawed at his throat. She was gone. She had run. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door and a heavy flashlight from a drawer. He burst out into the night, the cold hitting him like a fist. His mind raced. Where would she go? She knew nothing of these woods. The darkness was absolute, filled with unseen roots and sudden drops. He swept the beam of the flashlight across the soft ground near the edge of the trees. There, small footprints, already filling with dew, dug deep into the earth. She had been running. "Emma!" His voice tore through the night, a raw command laced with an emotion he refused to name. He followed the tracks, his long strides covering the ground quickly. Branches whipped at his face, but he barely felt them. All he could see was her, lost, scared, alone. All because of him, because of his words, because he had let his world, his ugly, violent world, poison the one good thing that had walked into it. He pushed himself faster, the beam of light cutting a frantic path through the darkness. The thought of her out here, cold and terrified, was a torment worse than any physical threat he had ever faced. The forest was a living, breathing monster. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves was a new terror that sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through Emma's veins. She was hopelessly lost. Trees were indistinct shapes looming out of the oppressive dark. She had tripped and fallen more times than she could count. Her ankle throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. She was shivering uncontrollably, a deep, bone-rattling cold that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the chill of utter despair. Then she heard his voice, a furious roar that seemed to shake the very trees. "Emma!" He sounded angry. She knew he would be. She had defied him. She had run from his protection, making her another problem to be solved. She scrambled behind the massive trunk of an old pine tree, pressing herself against the rough bark. She held her breath, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. Maybe he would pass by. Maybe he would give up. The beam of a flashlight sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the forest floor. It passed her hiding spot, and for a second she thought she was safe. But then it swung back, relentless, and pinned her in its bright, unforgiving glare. She squeezed her eyes shut. She was caught. Heavy footsteps crunched on the fallen leaves, stopping just a few feet away. She slowly opened her eyes. Jack stood over her, his chest heaving. In the stark light, his face was a mask of shadows and hard angles. He looked like a vengeful pawn come to cast judgment. She braced herself for the explosion, for the cold, cutting words. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice a broken, trembling thing. The words tumbled out, desperate and small. I'll go. I won't be a problem for you anymore. I promise. I know I'm my own." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any shouting could have been. Then he moved. He dropped to one knee in the dirt and leaves in front of her. He was so close she could feel the heat coming off him. He reached out a hand and she flinched, expecting a rough grip. Instead, his fingers gently, so gently, brushed a damp leaf from her cheek. The unexpected tenderness made a sob catch in her throat. "A problem?" His voice was low and rough, like gravel scraping against stone. He leaned closer, his piercing blue eyes searching her face. "You heard me on the phone. You thought that was about you? You thought you were the liability?" The disbelief in his tone was genuine. It was so real it made her head spin. He didn't wait for her to answer. The words started pouring out of him, fast and uncharacteristically frantic. He told her about a shipment, a container full of contraband that had been seized, a business deal gone wrong, an asset, a liability. The words were clinical, cold, but they were about his world, not about her. "It was never for you, Emma," he said, his voice dropping, becoming thick with emotion. "Never." She looked up into his eyes, and she saw the raw, unguarded truth there. But the wound was still fresh, the fear still deeply rooted. "But it's true," she insisted, her voice small. "I'm putting you in danger. Your men, your business, my father. You have to get rid of me. It's the only way to fix it." A muscle jumped in his jaw. He gripped her upper arms, his hold not painful but impossibly firm. anchoring her to him. He leaned in until his forehead was nearly touching hers. "Fix it?" he growled, the sound vibrating through her. "Do you think I would ever let you go?" His eyes burned into hers, all the control, all the cold calculation gone, replaced by a wild, raw desperation. "After everything, do you have any idea what you've done to me?" The question hung in the cold night air, a confession more powerful than any declaration of love. What had she done to him? She had crashed into his perfectly ordered world, bleeding and broken, and had somehow become its center. In his eyes, she saw not the Mafia boss, but a man terrified of losing the one thing he hadn't known he needed. The armor was gone. The fortress around his heart had crumbled. And in the ruins she saw herself. All the fear, all the unspoken longing that had simmered between them for weeks, finally reached its boiling point. He closed the small distance that remained. His mouth found hers, not with gentleness, but with a fierce, desperate hunger. It was a kiss that was a question and an answer, a punishment and a prayer. It tasted of the cold night air, of rain-soaked earth, and of a profound, soul-shattering relief. Something inside her broke free. All the walls she had built around her own heart shattered into dust. She answered his kiss with a fervor that matched his own. Her hands flew up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. This was not a gentle exploration. It was a collision of two lonely, damaged souls finding their anchor in the storm. It was a desperate, primal need to feel, to connect, to erase the pain and the fear. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together. The sounds of the forest had faded away into a muffled silence. The only thing that was real was the circle of his arms, the steady beat of his heart against hers. "Let's go home," he murmured. His voice thick and husky, the word home landed in her heart not as a place but as a promise. He meant the cabin. He meant him. Without another word, he scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He held her tight against his chest and turned, his steps sure and steady as he carried her back through the darkness. He didn't stumble once. Back inside the warm cabin, he didn't put her down. He carried her past the crackling fire, through the living room, and straight into the bedroom. He laid her gently on the bed, the soft mattress a stark contrast to the hard, cold ground of the forest. The firelight from the other room cast a warm, golden glow across the walls, flickering over their skin. The world outside, her monstrous father, Jack's dangerous enemies, it all ceased to exist. There was only this room, only him. His eyes never left hers as he slowly, deliberately began to remove her damp, cold clothes. His touch was no longer hesitant or uncertain. It was possessive, yet reverent. Every movement was a confirmation. "You're here, you're safe. You are mine." She watched him, her own fear finally, truly gone, replaced by a deep, aching trust. When he was done, he shed his own jacket and shirt, and the faint light caught the network of old scars on his torso, maps of a life she couldn't imagine. He was a man made of violence and control, yet as he came to her, his expression was one of complete and utter vulnerability. This was not about power or possession. It was about two people finally letting go, finally finding a sanctuary in each other's arms. Soft morning light filtered through the thin curtains, painting the room in pale shades of gray and gold. Emma woke slowly, cocooned in a warmth she had never known. She was wrapped in Jack's arms, her back pressed against his chest. His breathing was a slow, steady rhythm against her neck. For the first time in her adult life, she woke without a knot of icy fear in her stomach. The ever-present hum of anxiety was gone. In its place was a quiet, profound sense of peace. She felt safe. She felt whole. She carefully turned in his arms to face him. In the sleep, the hard lines of his face were softened. The ruthless mask he wore for the world was gone, revealing the man beneath. His dark hair was messy, falling across his forehead. She saw the faded white scar that cut through his eyebrow, a permanent mark of his past. On an impulse, she reached out and traced its path with the tip of her finger. He stirred at her touch, his blue eyes fluttering open. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his gaze clear and deep, holding her in a quiet moment of perfect understanding. Then he reached over to the bedside table, his hand closing around something. He brought his hand back, his fist resting on the pillow between them. Slowly he opened his fingers. Lying in his palm was her silver locket, but it was transformed. The tarnish of age was gone, polished away to a brilliant, liquid shine. She looked closer, her breath catching in her throat. The dent, the small, painful imperfection that had been there for as long as she could remember, was gone. The surface was smooth, perfect, and unbroken. He took her hand, turning it palm up, and placed the gleaming locket into it. His fingers gently closed over hers, enveloping the small, heart-shaped piece of metal and her hand in his. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The restored locket was a silent vow, a promise to heal what was broken, a pledge to protect her heart, a guarantee that with him, she would be kept whole. Tears welled in Emma's eyes, but for the first time, they were not tears of pain or fear. They were tears of a gratitude so immense, so overwhelming, it filled every empty space inside her. She clutched the locket, the cool, smooth metal, a solid reality in her hand. A new beginning. The morning light at the cabin was soft, filtering through the tall pines and laying gentle stripes across the wooden floor. Emma lay still, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, the crackle of a new fire in the hearth, the distant call of a bird over the lake, the steady, slow rhythm of Jack's breathing beside her. In her palm, she felt the cool, smooth weight of the silver locket. It was whole again. The dent was gone, the surface polished to a gentle gleam. It felt different, heavier, as if he had filled the empty space not just with metal, but with the silent promise he had made in the dark. She turned her head on the pillow to look at him. In sleep, the hard lines of his face seemed to soften. The guarded tension in his jaw was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness. A dark lock of hair had fallen across his forehead. She had an almost overwhelming urge to reach out and brush it back, but she resisted. This fragile piece felt like a soap bubble, beautiful and perfect, and she was terrified that the slightest touch might make it pop. They had returned from the woods the night before, their desperate kiss turning into something deeper, something that healed and bound them together in the warmth of the cabin. But she knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in her stomach that the world outside this haven had not stopped turning. Later, as the aroma of coffee filled the small kitchen, Jack stood by the window looking out at the lake. He was dressed again in his dark, severe clothes. The Mafia boss was back, his posture rigid, his gaze distant. The peace of the morning was already fading. Tommy had arrived less than an hour ago, his car a dark intrusion in the tranquil landscape. Now their low voices drifted from the living room. Emma stayed in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, pretending to be busy. She didn't want to eavesdrop, but she couldn't block out the words. "Richard is getting desperate," Tommy said, his voice a low rumble. "He's putting pressure on the Moretti family, promising them a bigger piece of the port if they help him get her back." There was a pause. Emma held her breath. "He's painting you as weak, Jack, distracted. The old guard is getting nervous. They think she's made you vulnerable." "I am vulnerable." Jack's voice was quiet, but it cut through the air with chilling honesty. "He went after my shipments. He tried to take her in broad daylight. This isn't just pressure, it's a declaration of war. He thinks because he has money and a clean public image, he can't be touched." "So what's the move?" Tommy asked. "We can't keep playing defense. It's costing us." Emma heard the clink of a glass, the splash of liquid. "We're not going to play defense," Jack said, his tone shifting, becoming the one she had first heard in the penthouse, cold and absolute. "We're going to end it. I'm not going to just hurt him. I'm going to dismantle his entire world. I'm going to expose his deals with the Morettis. I'm going to burn his reputation to the ground and hand the ashes to the feds." A cold thrill, part fear and part something else, shot through Emma. This was it, the final move. She put her mug down on the counter, her hand perfectly steady. She thought of the years spent tiptoeing around her own home. The constant anxiety, the flinching at every raised voice, the carefully constructed lies to hide the bruises. She thought of the girl who had collapsed in a filthy alley, begging a stranger for help. That girl was gone. She walked into the living room. Both men turned to look at her. Tommy's expression was guarded, wary of her presence in this strategy session. Jack's eyes, however, held a question. He saw the change in her immediately. Her spine was straight, her chin was up. Her fear was still there, a faint tremor deep inside, but it was now caged by a cold, hard resolve. "I can help," she said. Her voice didn't waver. Tommy shifted his weight. "Emma, this is not something you need to be involved in." "I've been involved since the day I was born," she replied, her gaze fixed on Jack. "You want to destroy him? I know how. My father is a man of ledgers and records. He trusts no one. He keeps everything documented, a private insurance policy against his partners." Jack leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Where?" "In his office, the one at his corporate headquarters downtown," she said, the details coming to her with perfect clarity. "Behind the large oil painting of the coast, the one to the left of his desk. It's not a real painting. It's the door to a small, hidden vault. I saw him use it once, years ago. He thought I was asleep on the sofa." She could still feel the terror of that moment, pretending to be unconscious while he punched in the code, her heart hammering against her ribs. That memory, once a source of trauma, was now a weapon. A slow, dangerous smile touched Jack's lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "A vault. He keeps everything there," Emma continued. "Financial records, correspondence with his associates, proof of every illegal transaction. It's all there. It's the key to everything." Tommy looked from her to Jack, a new respect dawning in his eyes. "She's right, Jack. If we can get our hands on that, it's over for him. We can leak it. He'll be finished with the feds, and the Morettis will cut him loose to save themselves." Jack was silent for a long moment, his piercing blue eyes studying Emma. He was seeing more than just an informant. He was seeing the fighter who had been forged in the fires of that house. He was seeing the woman who had run from him in the woods and then faced him with equal desperation. He nodded slowly. "All right, we'll move tonight." He stood up, the decision made. "Tommy, get the team ready. I want our best, no mistakes." As Tommy nodded and walked out to make the call, Jack turned back to Emma. "You'll be safe here. I'll leave 2 men." Emma shook her head. The motion was small but definite. "No." Jack's brow furrowed. "No." "I'm going with you," she said. It wasn't a request. He stared at her, his expression hardening again. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. I'm doing this so you never have to see him again." "And I appreciate that," she said, stepping closer to him. Her voice was quiet but intense. "More than you know, but you don't understand. Hiding here while you fight my battle for me, it won't fix anything. I'll still be afraid. I'll still be waiting for the other shoe to drop. I need to be there, Jack. I need to see it end." "Emma, you don't know what you're asking. If something goes wrong, I need to face him," she insisted, her brown eyes pleading with him to understand. "Not as his victim, not as his frightened little girl. I need him to see me standing next to you. I need him to see that I'm not his property anymore. That's the only way I'll ever truly be free. Please, He looked down at her, at the fierce determination in her face. He saw the strength she had claimed for herself, and he knew she was right. To keep her locked away, even for her own safety, would be to deny the very person she was becoming. It would be treating her like her father had, like a fragile thing to be owned and controlled. His duty was to protect her, but he was starting to understand that protection meant more than just shielding her from physical harm. It meant honoring her spirit. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking the faint scar there. "It won't be easy." "I know," she whispered, her body relaxing slightly at his touch. "Stay by my side. No matter what," he commanded, his voice low and firm. "I will," she promised. The city was a web of glittering lights below as they ascended in the glass elevator of the Hayes Corporation Tower. The silence inside the car was heavy, broken only by the soft hum of the machinery. Emma stood between Jack and Tommy, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. She could feel the hard warmth of Jack's arm brushing against hers, a solid, grounding presence in the sterile environment. His men, 4 of them, stood silent and watchful, their dark suits making them look like shadows given form. They had bypassed the building's security with an ease that was terrifying. A few quiet words from Tommy into a phone, a code punched into a service panel, and every camera, every alarm was blind to them. It was a display of power Emma had never witnessed up close. This was Jack's world, a place where doors opened without keys and problems were solved in the quiet of the night. The elevator chimed softly and the door slid open onto the top floor. The reception area was dark, a cavern of polished marble and expensive, uncomfortable-looking furniture. A massive, stylized H for Hayes was mounted on the wall, gleaming under the emergency lights. Her entire life had been lived under the shadow of that letter. Tonight, she would watch it fall. Jack gestured with his head and two of his men peeled off, moving silently down the corridor to secure the exits. Tommy led the way, with Jack and Emma following close behind. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild mix of terror and exhilarating purpose. Every step echoed on the polished floor, a countdown to the final confrontation. They reached the double doors of her father's office. Tommy paused, placing a hand on the handle, and looked back at Jack. Jack gave a single sharp nod. With a soft click, the lock gave way, and Tommy pushed the doors open. The office was exactly as she remembered, a monument to her father's ego. The massive mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface clear except for a leather-bound blotter and a single lamp that cast a pool of warm light. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled out like a carpet of diamonds. And sitting behind the desk, bathed in the lamplight, was Richard Hayes. He looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation, then to a carefully controlled smile when his eyes landed on Emma. He didn't seem to register the threat of the other men in the room. He only saw her. "Emma, darling," he said, his voice smooth as silk, the voice he used for investors and politicians. "What is all this? Did you finally tire of your little adventure? Come now, this has gone on long enough. These gentlemen can see themselves out." Emma felt a tremor of her old fear, the instinct to shrink back, to apologize. But then she felt Jack's presence beside her, solid and unmovable. She straightened her shoulders. Jack stepped forward, moving around the desk with a predator's grace. He ignored Richard completely. His gaze went straight to the oil painting on the wall. "A lovely piece," he said, his voice deceptively casual. "Is it an original?" Richard's smile tightened. His eyes darted from Jack to the painting, and for the first time a flicker of genuine alarm appeared. "What do you think you're doing? This is private property. I'll have you all arrested for trespassing." Jack didn't answer. He simply reached out, hooked his fingers behind the frame of the painting, and pulled. It swung outward on silent hinges, revealing the dark gray steel of a vault door with a digital keypad. Richard Hayes shot to his feet, his face turning pale. "Don't you dare!" Jack turned to him, a cold fire in his blue eyes. "It's over, Richard." He placed a small, sophisticated electronic device over the keypad. It whirred for a few seconds, and then with a heavy thud, the vault's locking bolts retracted. Tommy pulled the heavy door open. Inside, shelves were lined with black ledger books and stacks of file folders. Tommy reached in and pulled out a single ledger, opening it on the desk in front of Richard. The pages were filled with his neat, precise handwriting, detailing names, dates, and figures. A clear record of his partnership with the Moretti family. "You're a meticulous man," Jack said softly. "That's a rare quality. Unfortunately for you, it's about to be your ruin. By sunrise, copies of these will be on their way to the district attorney. Another set will be sent to the Morettis so they can see how you've been skimming from them for years. Your business partners, your political friends, they'll all see you for what you are. A fraud, a thief. You'll lose everything." Richard stared at the open ledger, his breathing becoming ragged. The mask of the charming businessman was cracking, shattering, revealing the snarling, cornered animal beneath. His empire, his reputation, his power. It was all turning to dust in front of his eyes. He looked up, his gaze sweeping past Jack, past Tommy. It settled on Emma. His eyes were filled with a venomous, possessive rage. "You," he hissed, the single word dripping with a lifetime of resentment. "You did this, my own flesh and blood. After everything I've given you, I gave you this life." Emma took a step forward, out from behind the shield of Jack's presence. She met her father's hateful stare without flinching. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. It was the voice of a survivor, not a victim. "You gave me nothing," she said. You took my childhood, You took my safety. You took my voice, but you don't have power over me anymore. It's over. Seeing her stand there, defiant and unbroken, was the one thing he couldn't bear. It was the ultimate loss of control. His face contorted into a mask of pure fury. His carefully constructed world was gone, and it was her fault. With a sudden, desperate movement, his hand shot to the side of his desk, pulling open a concealed drawer. His fingers closed around the cold, heavy steel of a pistol. In a single, fluid motion, he brought it up. He didn't aim it at Jack, the man who had orchestrated his downfall. He didn't aim it at Tommy, the enforcer standing ready. His eyes, burning with a meshbound final act of possession, were locked on his daughter. He aimed the gun directly at Emma's heart. The world narrowed to the dark, perfect circle at the end of the barrel. It was a black hole promising to swallow all light, all sound, all hope. Emma felt the air leave her lungs in a silent gasp. Her entire life she had been running from a monster. Now the monster had a face, and it was her father's, twisted into a mask of victorious rage. His eyes, cold and triumphant, were locked on her. He had finally cornered her. Jack moved. It was not a lunge or a desperate leap, but a fluid shift of his body, placing himself partially in front of her. He became a shield of tailored wool and solid muscle. His scent, that familiar mix of expensive cologne and sheer resolve, filled her senses. He did not look at her. His piercing blue eyes were fixed on Richard, a silent challenge that crackled in the tense air of the office. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. There was only the stretched silence, the weight of Richard's finger on the trigger, the unyielding wall of Jack's back. Then a blur of motion from the side. Tommy, who had been a silent statue near the door, exploded into action. It was not a fight. It was a conclusion. One moment, Richard held the pistol. The next, Tommy's hand clamped down on his wrist with brutal efficiency. There was a sickening crack of bone, a strangled cry of pain from Richard, and the heavy pistol clattered harmlessly onto the plush carpet. Tommy kicked it away with a dismissive nudge of his polished shoe. He spun Richard around, forcing his arm up behind his back in a hold that made the man gasp and stumble. The power, the control, the manic confidence drained from Richard's face, replaced by the ugly shock of utter defeat. Just as the last echo of the falling gun faded, the grand office doors burst open. They did not swing, they were smashed inward, the fine wood splintering around the frame. Uniformed officers flooded the room, their movements practiced and overwhelming. Shouts of "Police, don't move!" filled the space, a chaotic but controlled wave of authority. They swarmed around Richard, their intentions clear. Jack had not just come for a confrontation. He had come to orchestrate an ending. He had tipped them off, giving them the evidence of Richard's dealings with the rival syndicate, the ledgers Emma had helped him find. An officer wrenched Richard from Tommy's grip and slammed him against his own mahogany desk, the surface rattling with the impact. Metal cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The fight was gone from him. He was just a man in an expensive suit, his face pale with sweat, his carefully crafted world collapsing into ruin around him. He turned his head, his venomous gaze finding Emma one last time. "You did this," he hissed, his voice no longer smooth and persuasive, but a raw, pathetic rasp. "You ungrateful little witch, you ruined everything." The words should have hurt. They should have been sharp little daggers finding the old, familiar wounds in her heart. But they weren't. Emma looked at the man who had haunted her every waking moment in her dreams. She saw not a father, not a powerful figure, but a cornered animal, pathetic in his rage. A profound, quiet finality settled over her. The fear that had lived under her skin for 22 years was simply gone. She felt the last invisible chain connecting her to him snap. She was free. Jack's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through her own. His touch was not a question, but a statement, a solid, warm anchor in the swirling chaos. She squeezed back, her eyes never leaving her father as they led him away, a disgraced man whose empire had just crumbled into dust. In the days that followed, the penthouse felt different. The silence was no longer sterile and heavy. It was peaceful. The constant, low-grade tension that had hummed beneath the surface of Jack's world had dissipated. The threat was gone. For the first time, the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to offer a view of a future. not just a reminder of a city full of enemies. One afternoon, Emma found Jack in his study, the city lights beginning to sprinkle across the dusk. He was on the phone, but his tone was not the clipped, dangerous one she had once feared. It was measured, firm, and final. He was speaking to one of his capos, one of the old guard who had served his father. "The arrangement is over," Jack said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "The shipments will be legitimate from now on. If you can't operate within those new lines, then we have nothing more to discuss." He listened for a moment, his expression unreadable. "That's your choice," he said, and ended the call. He placed the phone down on the desk and looked up, meeting Tommy's gaze. His right-hand man was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. Tommy had been listening to every call, watching Jack systematically dismantle the most violent parts of the empire he had inherited. He was cutting off the sources of blood money, severing ties that had existed for generations. It was a monumental risk. "They won't all like it," Tommy stated, his voice a low rumble. "Some of them only know the old way." "Then they can find a new boss," Jack replied without hesitation. "This business, my father's business, it cost him everything. It almost cost me everything." His eyes flickered towards the doorway where Emma stood watching, and a flicker of something soft crossed his face. "I'm building something else now. Something that lasts." Tommy's gaze followed Jack's. He looked at Emma, standing there not as a liability or a complication, but as the reason for this sea change. He saw the quiet strength in her posture, the peace in her eyes. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips. He gave a single, decisive nod. "It's the right move, Jack," he said, his loyalty unwavering. "It's time for something new." He was not just agreeing to a business strategy. He was giving his blessing to Jack's choice, to the man Jack was becoming for her. Months passed. The chill of autumn gave way to the deep cold of winter, and then melted into the tentative warmth of spring. The penthouse was no longer a cage, gilded or otherwise. It was a home. The stark, minimalist sofa was now softened by a thick, cream-colored throw blanket. A tall vase on the polished chrome coffee table was always filled with fresh flowers, usually white lilies, Emma's favorite. Stacks of novels and sketchbooks rested beside a worn leather armchair she had claimed as her own, positioned to catch the morning light. The air no longer smelled only of whiskey and conditioned air. Now it carried the faint, comforting sense of brewing coffee, old paper, and sometimes the perfume of lilies. Emma's presence had not just occupied the space, it had transformed it. She had filled its empty corners with life. She sat in her armchair now, a book resting in her lap, forgotten. Her gaze was on the city below, a sprawling tapestry of glittering lights against the deep violet of the evening sky. She felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling so foreign and yet so welcome. It was like learning to breathe again. The constant hum of anxiety that had been her lifelong companion had vanished. She was not waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was simply living. She heard the soft click of the front door and smiled without turning. A few moments later, she felt his presence behind her. Strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against a firm, warm chest. Jack rested his chin on her shoulder, his own gaze following hers out the window. He was not in one of his impeccable suits. He wore dark trousers and a soft gray sweater, his sleeves pushed up to his forearms. He was not Jack the Ghost Costello, feared head of the city's underworld. He was just Jack, a man home from a long day, seeking the comfort of the woman he loved. They stood like that for a long time, watching the endless river of headlights flowing through the city's arteries. The silence between them was easy, comfortable, filled with everything that no longer needed to be said. All the fear, the desperation, the frantic uncertainty that had thrown them together now felt like a story from another lifetime. He pressed a soft kiss to her temple, his voice a low, gentle whisper against her hair. "You're safe," he murmured. It was the promise he had made her from the very beginning, the one he had torn his own world apart to keep. A slow smile spread across Emma's face. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. Her fingers traced the collar of his sweater, her touch light and sure. She looked up into his piercing blue eyes that no longer held a cold, guarded distance, but a deep, steady warmth that was reserved only for her. No, she replied, her own voice clear and soft. She reached up, her fingers brushing against the silver locket at her throat. It gleamed in the soft light from the lamp, its surface smooth and whole, the dent long gone. It was a constant, tangible reminder not of a mended object, but of a mended life, a mended heart. She looked back into his eyes, her heart full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. I'm home. The word hung in the air between them, more powerful than any declaration, more binding than any vow. It was the truth. Home was not four walls or a view of the city. It was the safety of his arms, the steady beat of his heart beneath her hand, the look in his eyes that told her she was cherished. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not fierce or desperate like their first one in the woods. It was deep and slow and peaceful, a kiss of arrival, of belonging. It was a kiss that held the promise of 1,000 quiet mornings and 1,000,000 city-lit nights together. Below them, the lights of the city glittered on, oblivious, bearing silent witness to the end of one story and the beautiful, quiet beginning of another. What would you have done? One line in the comments. Let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.